So welcome. We're going to talk a little bit more about how generative AI fits in with analytics governance and the new categories and realms that this has created in the data and analytics world. A little bit about me. I am the Director of AI Transformation and Engineering at Mimecast. I run a podcast about data called Unlocking Value with Data. I also write articles on Substack and Medium. Love the analytics space, love to talk about this stuff. So it's a bit more about me. So why are we talking about generative AI? Well, there's a reason 74% of organizations report positive ROI from their generative AI initiatives, and 45% of executives are saying they at least doubled their employee productivity out of their generative AI pilots and rollouts. And that's really important because one of the things that you hear more and more about is executives talking about generative AI, how they're deploying it in their businesses, how they're realizing productivity. And it's not this sort of behind the scenes data thing that we've had in the past where it's a little bit more mysterious. I think there's a lot more interest from executives in how do we get this up and running, how do we get it deployed into our employee base, and how do we start to recognize value out of it. So what does that actually mean? How does this manifest? So if we think about scaling your analytics programs with generative AI, that takes place in many different ways. There is automated generation of insights, which we see here at this conference, right? We have Agentforce, we have different things in the Salesforce platform. We have the natural language chat with your data experience. Now people want to ask questions and get responses back from their data rather than just having to know SQL, having to know how to interact at a very deep technical level. There's Code Assist, there's GitHub Copilot, there's Anthropic, code assisting tools, Cursor, all these things out there that are helping developers speed up their productivity. There's agentic workflows that's actually taking on work and performing that autonomous layer. And then there's generative AI fitting into your data pipelines, right? So before you used to have structured data and unstructured data were sort of very separate and distinct, and you had to do different workloads and combinations of things on them. Now that line's really starting to blur between what you can do with a data pipeline because of the advent of generative AI. And it's like utility is a Swiss Army knife, right? So you might have in the past have had to deploy a pretty heavy ML model to do sentiment. Now you can just make a generative AI call on your pipeline and get sentiment back within a few second call without having to deploy any ML or architecture overhead. And I just like to show a picture of where do you find that in your data stack, right? So if you think about it, that little purple star are all the places, and guess what? It's everywhere, right? It's on the back-end systems that are contributing. It's in your data warehouse. There's even whole new business tools around like Gong that are in the conversational AI space that are putting GenAI data into your ecosystem. There's orchestration tools like dbt contributing at the semantic layer and the code generation layer. Snowflake is getting into it with native, generative AI and LLM calls, along with the Snowpark capabilities. And then obviously, again, here at the conference, we're seeing Tableau and Salesforce going deep on their generative AI space too. So when you think about it, I talked a little bit about GenAI and your data pipelines and that unstructured data, which was really untapped from its potential before. Now you can, with function calls, the same you would do an aggregation or a sum or a count distinct, you have these capabilities at your fingertips, and it may vary slightly by your data warehouse provider, but you can essentially make these calls now to do summarization, answers, extraction. We want to classify different things, do that sentiment, parse documents, translate languages. And that could be a piece of your pipeline where you're bringing in an unstructured portion of data and saying, hey, I want you to classify this block of text and tell me whether there's a support issue here or not, right? And that can become a discrete part of your data and your data pipeline. So it's really powerful, right? And it makes the extension of a developer or a data professional that much more valuable, right? And the amount of things that you can do and the things that you can accomplish with much lower technical overhead. So when we talk about productivity gains, it's real on both the personal level of how do I contribute as a developer into this, and also how does the organization benefit as a whole. And just an example, so I pulled up something for the Snowflake users, again, if in your data warehouse of choice, you'll recognize this as just embedded in a select statement now, right? So before you might have to go out and make all these API calls to models and figure out how you get it back in and integrate that with your data. You can now put LLM calls directly in line with your data pipelines. And down below, so you'll see I have, I'm calling a model here, I'm giving it system instructions, I'm feeding it context-specific data here of like hyper-personalized information that should go back in and fed into that LLM at scale. I'm setting parameters on the LLM, and I'm getting back a result in which I can use right back in my data pipeline. So it sits right in the flow of how that whole process works. It really extends the capabilities of what you can do there. So what are some of the biggest factors you have to consider when governance comes into play with generative AI? How many people know the word idempotent now? Right? That's probably something we didn't hear a ton before, maybe sometimes before. You hear it all the time now. If you ask generative AI the same question on the same data 3 times in a row, you will get 3 different answers, right? Unless you figure out how you're going to structure that data. And generative AI can hallucinate, right? This is sort of a new concept that people are used to, like, well, my data is always the same and the results are always the same and I can test that and that always lines up to be the same thing. When now with the flexibility of this tool, we've opened up some different things that you have to consider with the way that you build your pipelines. So how do we deal with that? Well, there's a few different strategies you can put into play for this. You can structure your data, right? So you can take that unstructured data and you can turn it into structured outputs. You can create a structured sentiment score from your generative AI data, right? Take this support ticket, you're now analyzing sentiment and I want you to develop a score from -2 to +2 of severely negative to severely positive and create that as a structured data element within your pipeline, right? You can do the same thing for answer extraction or classification. You can take that interpretive data and distill it down to the thing that you actually want to get out of it, right? And say, how do I get this piece of information out? How do I structure it? Then I can trend it over time. I can see if the answer has changed from run to run, et cetera, right? The other thing you can do is you can introduce like scoring, confidence scores, right? This is not a new concept, but we have it in the realm of AI and ML. How confident are we that the answer that we actually extracted is the answer that we're displaying here? And if we think about it, in the generative AI world, it's interpretation, right? You're not always dealing with this situation where something is like totally right or totally wrong and there's no middle ground, right? So the other thing is systems like this will have scoring mechanisms built into it. Like these come out of the box with Snowflake. You can also build some of your own scoring mechanisms to say, well, that's great, but if somebody's going to make a decision off this piece of information, what's the context we should give them about how confident we are? And then lastly, you want to monitor your end outputs. Like something that Wiiisdom does here as well is, what are the trends over time? How do I trust that this information is right and being delivered to end users? So you can use all of these sort of tools underneath and with your GenAI solutions to say, just because there is variance here doesn't mean that you can't use it, you can't govern it, you can't monitor it over time. The other big piece is the semantic layer. And what is the semantic layer? It's really how GenAI understands the things that you're asking it to do, right? It is the translation of business language on top of your data. It's like the map, right? Underneath all the houses are your data points. And you want to say, I want to get from this house over here to that house over there. I'm going to draw you a map that's going to show you the streets and the places that you should go from here to there. And that's going to sit in between your data and could be BI tool here, could be your human interpreting the data. But how are they going to know that actual business definition is the thing that the business knows it by as well, right? So you got some sample questions here, like, what is a customer? That seems like a really simple question, but that can have a lot of variance. Does it mean that they're on a trial? Is it a paying customer? What if their subscription lapsed and they, they haven't re-upped yet, but they're in a grace period? Is that a customer, right? How is revenue calculated? When does fiscal year start at? These are all the little nuances that when you add them up together can create a huge variance in the answer that somebody expects to get and the answer that they get back. So bringing that semantic layer on top of your data will allow people to do that thing that they think GenAI can do, which is like, hey, go tell me how many customers we got last month and how much revenue that brought in. And then they go ask it and they get a hallucinated answer that's like nowhere even close to what the answer is that shows on your internal metrics dashboards. The other thing you can think about too is as we move into agentic and GenAI worlds, well, we already have some paradigms for how we should deal with this, right? If we move to an agentic world, you could think of that as a worker or role that can also inherit the properties of our human-based roles, right? So just because something is an agent doesn't mean it necessarily should have the scope of access to all of the data, to sensitive information, to PII, et cetera. So as you're setting up these different things, you can assign these entities the same types of RBAC controls that you would for other things to make sure that the financial agent doesn't get access to the workforce information and vice versa and all that kind of stuff, so where it's appropriate. And it's scoped to the right stuff. Another place that you can deploy some techniques to help with agentic workflows is to think about multi-agent architectures. So we live in a world where the race for the LLM has been to a bigger, more parameter LLM over time. How many trillions of parameters can we fit into a gigantic LLM, right? In GPT 4.0, GPT 5, you have an LLM that can tell you how to bake cookies and disassemble a Ford F-150 engine. Does it really need to know how to do all those things like at once? And is that the right scope of context for it to have? Probably not. So as you think about how you deploy agents in your environment, you don't have to use gigantic scoped context windows and agents for everything. You can break those down into smaller composable tasks, which then have less chance of hallucination, less chance of running into context window limitations, and you can monitor those outputs more closely. And so you have a series of agents that are going out, performing these tasks, and you can build in QA layers as well. So on that output side, you can actually have something that's checking and saying, if you have a QA agent whose responsibility is to go back and check the structure and parameters of a task, you can have that coordinate against your multi-agent architecture that finally sits in between that and your output layer. So, I think this is kind of the same in the human paradigm as we talked before. You wouldn't expect one person at your company to do every task in the company, right? It's not a reasonable expectation. There's not enough expertise or context to do that job well. So if you compose it down into smaller roles, you'll get better results out of it. So where will I end this? Well, GenAI opened a new era of analytics, but it comes with new governance challenges. Steve Jobs, probably. Maybe not. So definitely a lot to think about. Thank you for attending my mini session today. Hope you learned something out of it. Happy to take questions.